The Palace of Versailles stands as a monument to absolute power, its golden gates reflecting centuries of intrigue, passion, and political maneuvering. Behind the gilded mirrors and elaborate ceremonies of the French court, one of history's most scandalous love affairs would unfold, forever changing the trajectory of the French monarchy. This is the story of an aging king who found unexpected passion in his final years, and a woman of humble origins who rose to become one of the most powerful figures in France, only to meet a tragic end on the guillotine. The man at the center of our story was born into unimaginable privilege. Louis XV inherited the throne of France as a child of 5, following the death of his great-grandfather, the legendary Sun King. The young Louis was beautiful, intelligent, and melancholic, carrying the weight of a kingdom on small shoulders. The court whispered that he was the most handsome king France had ever known, with dark eyes that could command a room and a presence that spoke of divine right. For decades, Louis ruled France with varying degrees of success. He married Marie Antoinette, a Polish princess chosen more for political convenience than love, and together they produced 10 children. By all accounts, Marie was kind, pious, and devoted, but the spark of passion between them dimmed quickly. The king, trapped in the suffocating formality of court life, began to seek warmth elsewhere. The Parc aux Cerfs, a private residence near Versailles, became infamous throughout Europe. Here, the king entertained a succession of young mistresses, carefully selected and presented to him like offerings to a god. The arrangement was organized with cold efficiency, the women often unaware of their royal lover's true identity. This system continued for years, feeding the king's appetites while protecting the dignity of the crown. But it was hollow, mechanical, devoid of genuine connection. Then came Madame de Pompadour, and everything changed. Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, who would become the Marquise de Pompadour, was intelligent, cultured, and possessed of extraordinary charm. She became not just the king's mistress, but his closest friend and advisor. For nearly 20 years, she dominated the court and influenced policy. When she died, Louis was devastated. He was approaching 60, an old man by the standards of his time, worn down by years of war, political intrigue, and personal loss. The court assumed the king's days of passion were behind him. They were spectacularly wrong. To understand Madame du Barry, we must first understand Jeanne Bcu. She was born illegitimate, the daughter of a seamstress named Bcu. Her father's identity remains disputed to this day, though some whispered he was a friar. What is certain is that Jeanne entered the world with nothing, no title, no fortune, no prospects beyond what her beauty and wit could provide. Growing up in Paris, Jeanne learned early how to navigate a world that offered women few choices. She was employed in various households, her stunning looks and natural charm opening doors that would have remained closed to others. Some historians suggest she worked as a companion in a gambling house. Others claim she was a courtesan, though the evidence remains murky. What cannot be disputed is that Jeanne Bcu possessed extraordinary beauty, described by contemporaries as transcendent, with golden hair, azure eyes, and skin like porcelain. Her life changed when she encountered Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a nobleman of dubious reputation known as the Roué. He was a professional facilitator of liaisons, a man who made his living connecting wealthy aristocrats with beautiful women. In Jeanne, he saw potential that went beyond simple transactions. He saw a woman who could captivate a king. The problem was access. Even in the libertine court of Louis XV, there were protocols that could not be ignored. A woman of Jeanne's background could not simply be presented to the king. She needed legitimacy, a veneer of respectability. The solution was as cynical as it was effective. Jean-Baptiste arranged for Jeanne to marry his brother, Guillaume, the Comte du Barry, in a ceremony that was legal but purely transactional. Guillaume returned to his estate in Toulouse immediately after, never to consummate the marriage or claim any real relationship with his new bride. Now styled as the Comtesse du Barry, Jeanne had the necessary credentials to enter the world of Versailles. What happened next would shock France and Europe. The winter evening when Jean du Barry was formally presented to King Louis XV at Versailles, the court watched with barely concealed disdain. Here was a woman of no real breeding, no established family, no credentials beyond a marriage of convenience and undeniable beauty. The presentation required a sponsor, a woman of unquestionable nobility willing to vouch for the newcomer. After much difficulty, Jean-Baptiste du Barry secured the sponsorship of Madame de Barne, a countess desperate for money and willing to overlook propriety for the right price. The king was immediately captivated. At 58, Louis had thought himself beyond such complete infatuation, but Jean awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. Unlike the calculating courtiers who surrounded him, or the frightened girls of the Parc aux serfs, or even the sophisticated Madame de Pompadour, Jean was unguarded, natural, joyful. She laughed easily and spoke without the measured caution that defined every other conversation at Versailles. For a man who had spent his entire life in a gilded cage, Jean represented freedom. The affair moved with stunning speed. Within weeks, Jean was installed in apartments directly above the king's private chambers, connected by a hidden staircase that allowed the monarch to visit her at any hour without detection. The symbolism was lost on no one. These had been Madame de Pompadour's apartments, the seat of power for 2 decades. But where Pompadour had been welcomed, even celebrated by much of the court for her intelligence and political acumen, Jean du Barry was met with unveiled hostility. The old nobility, the court faction known as the Devets, who advocated for traditional morality, and those who simply resented the rapid ascension of a woman they viewed as little better than a prostitute, all united in their opposition. The attacks were vicious and unrelenting. Pamphlets circulated throughout Paris, crude verses and cartoons depicting the new favorite in the most degrading terms. The word whore was used openly. Courtiers who had smiled at previous royal mistresses now sneered at Jean, refusing to acknowledge her presence or speak her name. One woman led the resistance with particular fervor, the king's eldest daughter, Madame Adelaide. She organized her siblings, convincing them to maintain a dignified silence around du Barry, to treat her as if she were invisible. The king's daughters would not bend, would not grant this interloper the legitimacy of their recognition. And then there was Marie Antoinette, the young Dauphine, married to Louis's grandson, the future Louis XVI, arrived at Versailles from Austria with strict instructions from her mother, Empress Maria Theresa. The empress was appalled by the presence of du Barry and commanded her daughter to have no contact with this woman of ill repute. For Maria Theresa, the matter was both moral and political. The Austrian alliance was crucial to France's position in Europe, and she would not see it tarnished by association with a courtesan. Marie Antoinette, just a teenager, followed her mother's wishes with the fervor of youth. She refused to speak to Madame du Barry, refused even to acknowledge her existence. At court functions, she would literally look through the older woman as if she were made of glass. The situation grew increasingly awkward and politically dangerous. The conflict between Austria and France over du Barry might seem petty, but it revealed the complex web of diplomacy that governed European relations. France had fought against Austria for generations, but recent wars had reshuffled the deck. The 7 Years' War, disastrous for France, had been fought with Austria as an ally. This diplomatic revolution was fragile, maintained through careful negotiation and the marriage between Marie Antoinette and the Dauphin. Madame du Barry's presence threatened to destabilize everything. Austrian diplomats complained formally about her influence over the king. Maria Theresa wrote letters expressing her horror that such a woman had access to state secrets. The French foreign minister, the Duc de Choiseul, who had arranged the Austrian marriage and championed the alliance, saw du Barry as a threat to his entire political program. Choiseul made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he could use the king's daughters and Marie Antoinette to force du Barry from court. He underestimated both the king's devotion to his mistress and du Barry's growing political sophistication. The showdown came to a head over the matter of Choiseul's policies. The Duke had been leading France toward another war, seeking revenge for previous defeats. Louis, weary of conflict and swayed by Du Barry and her allies who argued for peace, decided he had had enough. In a stunning reversal, the most powerful man in France was dismissed. Choiseul was exiled from court, his entire political network dismantled. Madame Du Barry had won her first major political victory. With her primary enemy vanquished, Jeanne Du Barry entered the peak of her power. The apartments at Versailles were just the beginning. The king showered her with jewelry worth fortunes, estates throughout France, and an allowance that exceeded the budget of small nations. The chateau at Louveciennes, a masterpiece of architecture nestled in parkland along the Seine, became her private domain, decorated with art and furniture of breathtaking value. But Du Barry was more than just a kept woman accumulating treasures. She began to exercise real political influence. Ministers sought her favor, knowing that a word from her to the king could make or break careers. She championed the appointment of the Duc de Choiseul as foreign minister, supporting a faction that favored peace and reform over endless military adventures. She advocated for economic policies that would ease the tax burden on the common people, perhaps remembering her own origins. Her patronage of the arts became legendary. She commissioned works from the finest artists of the age. François Boucher painted her multiple times, capturing her sensuality and grace. She supported writers, musicians, and architects, creating a cultural circle that rivaled any salon in Paris. The objects she acquired, furniture by the great ebonists, porcelain from Sèvres, jewels and paintings and sculptures, represented not just personal luxury, but an understanding of taste and beauty that surprised her critics. Yet the hostility never entirely disappeared. The pamphlets continued, growing more vicious as Du Barry's power increased. They called her the whore who rules France, accused her of every vice imaginable, blamed her for the kingdom's mounting financial problems. Much of this was unfair. France's debts stemmed from decades of warfare, particularly the ruinous 7 Years' War that had ended before Du Barry even entered the picture. But she made a convenient scapegoat. The question of Marie Antoinette remained unresolved. The Dauphine's continued refusal to acknowledge Du Barry created diplomatic incidents and personal tension. Finally, after years of pressure from the Austrian ambassador and her own advisors, Marie Antoinette capitulated. At a court function, in front of dozens of witnesses, she turned to Madame Du Barry and spoke a single, carefully neutral sentence. There are a lot of people at Versailles today. It was nothing, barely more than an acknowledgement of Du Barry's physical presence. But it was enough. The tension that had gripped the court for years eased. Du Barry had achieved what she needed most, a form of acceptance, however grudging, from the royal family itself. For 4 years, Jeanne Du Barry reigned as the uncrowned queen of Versailles. The king, aging and increasingly withdrawn from the demanding ceremonials of court life, found in her a refuge. In her apartments, or at Louveciennes, he could relax, speak freely, even laugh. She organized intimate suppers with a small circle of friends, creating the informal atmosphere Louis craved after decades of rigid protocol. Their relationship, while undoubtedly based initially on physical attraction, had deepened into genuine affection. Letters between them reveal tenderness and mutual concern. When Louis was away, he wrote to her frequently, and she responded with letters that mixed playfulness with genuine emotion. They were, in their way, happy, but time was running out. In the spring, Louis began to feel unwell. He had been on a hunting trip, one of the few activities that still gave him pleasure, when fever struck. Initially, no one was particularly concerned. The king had survived illnesses before, but this time was different. The fever intensified, and red spots appeared on his skin. The court physicians, summoning their best diagnostic skills, delivered a terrifying verdict: smallpox. In the 18th century, smallpox was a death sentence as often as not. The disease ravaged the body, causing hideous disfigurement and, frequently, death. There was no cure, no treatment beyond rest and hope. The king's rooms at Versailles became a sick room, heavy with the smell of illness and fear. Madame Du Barry remained at his bedside through the early days, desperate to help to comfort, to will him back to health. But as the disease progressed and the king's condition deteriorated, the Devets faction saw their opportunity. Led by the king's daughters, they demanded that Louis receive last rites, that he prepare his soul for death. And according to the strict protocols of the Catholic Church, a man about to receive the sacraments could not die in a state of sin. The king's mistress had to go. The confrontation was brutal. Du Barry was informed that she had to leave immediately, that her presence prevented the king from receiving spiritual comfort. She resisted, pleading to remain, but the pressure was overwhelming. In her final moments with Louis, they could barely speak. The king was already descending into delirium, his once handsome face ravaged by disease. She left Versailles in tears, exiled to the Duc de Choiseul's estate. Days later, King Louis XV died in agony. His grandson became Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, the young woman who had once refused even to acknowledge Du Barry's existence, became Queen of France. For Madame Du Barry, the king's death meant the end of everything she had known. The new king's advisors wasted no time. She was ordered to leave court permanently and was banished to a convent for a period of penitence, a humiliation designed to remind her of her place. She endured months of isolation before being allowed to retire to Louveciennes. The chateau became her sanctuary and her prison. She lived comfortably on the fortune she had accumulated, but she was persona non grata at Versailles. The new court had no use for the previous king's mistress. Marie Antoinette, now queen, showed her neither mercy nor interest. The woman who had once wielded such influence was reduced to living quietly in the countryside, entertaining old friends and trying to preserve her wealth against the mounting financial chaos engulfing France. She was still beautiful in her 40s, still charming, still capable of attracting admiration. She took lovers, including the Duc de Brissac, a general of the ancien régime who became devoted to her. For a time, it seemed she might live out her days in peaceful obscurity, a relic of the old regime gradually fading from memory. Then came the Revolution. The fall of the Bastille in July marked the beginning of the end for the world Du Barry had known. The revolutionaries attacked not just the monarchy, but everything associated with it, the privileges, the wealth, the entire social structure that had defined France for centuries. Former courtiers fled the country by the thousands, seeking safety in England, Austria, anywhere beyond the reach of revolutionary justice. Du Barry initially tried to remain neutral, hoping her distance from the current royal family might protect her. But in the revolution's eyes, she was guilty by association. Her wealth, her title, her past relationship with Louis XV all marked her as an enemy of the people. The situation became desperate when thieves broke into Louveciennes and stole her jewels, a collection worth an unimaginable sum. Du Barry made a fateful decision. She traveled to England repeatedly, ostensibly to track down and recover her stolen property. But the revolutionaries suspected, probably correctly, that these trips were also about moving assets out of France, preparing for permanent exile. On her final return to France, she was arrested. The charges were vague, but damning in the climate of terror that gripped Paris. She had associated with enemies of the Republic, had corresponded with émigrés, had failed to demonstrate proper revolutionary ardor. In truth, the specific charges hardly mattered. She was a symbol of the old regime, and the revolution demanded symbols to destroy. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not a court in any traditional sense. It was a machine designed to legitimate executions, to provide a veneer of justice to political murder. Thousands passed through its doors, and few emerged alive. When Madame Du Barry faced her judges, she understood that the verdict had been decided before she entered the room. The prosecutor recited her crimes. She had been the king's mistress, had influenced state policy, had lived in luxury while the people starved. Never mind that most of these events had occurred decades earlier, or that she had supported policies favorable to the common people, or that her personal wealth had come from the king's generosity rather than any exploitation of her own. In the New France, her mere existence was an offense. Du Barry defended herself with surprising dignity. She had committed no crime, she insisted. She had been loyal to France, had never conspired against the revolution, had remained in the country when she could have fled. But the tribunal was unmoved. The verdict was guilty, the sentence death. In her cell, awaiting execution, Jean du Barry finally broke. Unlike many aristocrats who went to the guillotine with stoic resignation or even defiance, she was terrified. She had clawed her way up from nothing, had experienced heights of luxury and power that most could never imagine. She was not ready to die. On a cold December morning, Madame du Barry was taken from her cell and loaded into a cart. The journey through Paris to the Place de la Révolution took her past streets she had known in luxury, now filled with crowds baying for blood. She could see the scaffold rising before her, the blade of the guillotine gleaming in the weak winter light. Unlike most victims of the terror, du Barry did not maintain composure. She pleaded with the crowd for mercy, begged them to spare her life, screamed in terror as she was dragged to the platform. Some in the crowd were moved to pity. Many more were disgusted by what they saw as cowardice. But none stepped forward to save her. As the executioner prepared her for the blade, du Barry cried out one more time. Encore un moment, Monsieur le Barreau, un petit moment. One more moment, Mr. Executioner, just a little moment. It was the desperate plea of a woman who had lost everything and now faced losing life itself. The executioner did not pause. The blade fell, and Jean Beau, Comtesse du Barry, former mistress to the King of France, died at the age of 50. Her death sent shockwaves through revolutionary Paris, not because anyone mourned her particularly, but because her terror was so unrestrained. Most aristocrats had maintained dignity at the end, treating the scaffold as a final performance, a last assertion of superiority over the mob. Du Barry's raw fear reminded everyone, executioners and victims alike, that beneath all the political theater, the revolution was killing actual human beings who desperately wanted to live. The story of Louis XV and Madame du Barry reveals the complex intersection of personal desire and political power. Their relationship began as a libertine king's infatuation with a beautiful woman, but it became something more, a genuine connection between two people trapped in roles neither had entirely chosen. Louis was born to be king and spent his life struggling with the expectations and limitations of absolute power. Jean was born with nothing and clawed her way to the summit of French society through beauty, charm, and intelligence. Together, they found a space where the rigid protocols of Versailles loosened slightly, where a man could be more than a monarch and a woman more than her origins. But their story is also a tragedy of missed opportunities. Louis's reign, which had begun with such promise, ended in disillusionment and failure. The financial catastrophes, the military defeats, the growing disconnect between the monarchy and the people, all of these preceded and transcended du Barry's influence. Yet she became a convenient scapegoat, a woman blamed for problems that had roots in decades of policy mistakes. The revolution that killed her was in many ways a response to the world she represented, a world of grotesque inequality, where kings could spend fortunes on mistresses while peasants starved. The revolutionaries were right to condemn the system, but in their zeal for justice, they created new horrors, turning the guillotine into an assembly line of death. Du Barry's legacy has been contested ever since. To some, she remains the ultimate courtesan, a woman who used her sexuality to achieve power and wealth. To others, she was a survivor who made the best of limited options in a society that offered women few paths to agency. The truth, as always, is complicated. What cannot be denied is that Jean du Barry lived one of the most remarkable lives of her century. From illegitimate daughter of a seamstress to mistress of the King of France, from political power broker to revolutionary victim, she experienced the full arc of ancien régime society and its violent collapse. She was present at the end of one world and the bloody birth of another. In the gardens at Louveciennes, the chateau still stands, much altered from du Barry's time, but bearing traces of her presence. The art she collected hangs in museums around the world. The jewelry she wore, or at least the pieces that survived theft and revolution, occasionally appears at auction, selling for millions. But perhaps the most interesting legacy is the one we cannot quantify. Du Barry represented a moment when rigid social barriers could be breached, when a woman without title or family could, through force of personality, reach the pinnacle of power. That this story ended badly does not diminish the audacity of the climb. In an age that claimed to believe in fixed social orders ordained by God, Jean Beaulieu, Du Barry proved that the barriers were more permeable than anyone admitted. King Louis XV and Madame du Barry's love affair scandalized France and contributed, in some small way, to the cascade of events that led to revolution. But at its core, it was a human story. An aging man finding unexpected joy in his final years. A woman from nothing creating a life of beauty and influence. Two people connecting across the vast gulf of class and circumstance, finding in each other something that made the constraints of their world more bearable. That their story ended in separate tragedies. Louis dying in agony, Du Barry dying in terror, does not erase the reality of their connection. In the glittering, vicious, impossible world of Versailles, they found each other. For a few years, against all odds and opposition, they were happy. In a long history of royal affairs, there are worse legacies than that. The last word on Madame du Barry perhaps belongs not to her accusers or her admirers, but to those who knew her personally. The artist Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun, who painted her and knew her well, wrote after her death that Du Barry was kind, generous, and without malice. In a court famous for its cruelty, that was no small distinction. Whatever her origins, whatever the nature of her rise to power, Jean du Barry retained something essential, a warmth and humanity that survived even the corrupting influence of Versailles. The guillotine that ended her life could not erase the remarkable arc of her story. From the streets of Paris to the heights of power, from the king's bedchamber to the scaffold, Madame du Barry lived through one of history's most turbulent periods. She was a woman who refused to accept the limitations society placed on her, who reached for more than she was supposed to want, who paid the ultimate price for her ambition, but who, for a time, actually achieved the impossible. This is the story of King Louis XV and Madame du Barry, a love affair that illuminated the last days of the ancien régime, a relationship that combined genuine affection with political consequence, personal desire with historical significance. It is a story of power and passion, of triumph and tragedy, of two people who found each other in the shadows of Versailles and whose connection echoed through the violent birth of the modern world.